Hey, good to be back with you. Our thought for today is a kind of modified version of Nat King Cole. They tried to tell us we're too old, and they do at election day. The left's view is that the right is old and dying and on its way out. Essentially, the Democrats in the US believe in what they call the coalition of the ascendant. Hispanics, gays, Muslims, the transgendered. And Hillary Clinton's theory was that if you put together the coalition of the ascendant, it beats all the old, dying white males that the Democrats had no interest in. Donald Trump proved them wrong, and Donald Trump won the election. But people say, oh, don't worry about it. Those Trump voters, 4 years' time, half of them are going to be dead, so don't worry about it. Same thing with Brexit in the United Kingdom. Everyone said, well, the young voted for Europe. It's these old, bitter, nationalistic little Englanders in their narrow, little xenophobic world who voted for Brexit. And if you, depending on how much analysis you do of the voting results, you can kind of support that. But today I want to talk about an exception to it, because there's a kind of crude demographic arithmetic in this, that as Bill Clinton would say, the children are our future. Or as the young, blonde, blue-eyed Aryan sings in the movie Cabaret, tomorrow belongs to me. And at the end of the number, as the crowd cheers, he gives the Hitler salute, and you realize he's a Nazi youth. And in a sense, tomorrow did belong to him and to the Nazi party in Hitler's Germany. The young get old, and then there are some new young people to take over. The phrase, when we talk about reformists and radicals, we use the phrase Young Turks. And we use that phrase because back in the dying days of the Ottoman Sultanate, the reformers and the radicals were indeed Young Turks. They were literally Young Turks. And they were the ones who eventually, after the First World War, abolished the caliphate, and Kemal Ataturk rose to power and created a modern secular Turkey. But then the Young Turks got old. And what happened was that modern, secular, Kemalist, European, Ruthenian Turkey was outbred by the irredentist, Islamic, rural, Asian, Anatolian Turkey. And they had a big bunch of kids, and all those kids spread out of Anatolia and into the cities, and in a sense, the new Young Turks overwhelmed the old Kemal Ataturk Young Turks, who'd all gotten pretty old and wrinkly by then. And I mention this on this particular day because everyone who's paid any attention to Turkey in the last few years knows that it has what you might call a soft Islamist government that is getting harder and harder, and that you see more and more covered women in formerly secular Turkey. And today the final penny dropped, as it were, when the Turkish army, which is supposed to be the guardian of modern Turkish European secularism, today caved in and decided that women could go covered in the Turkish military. As I said, sometimes the Young Turks get old. And careless Democrats in America and socialists in Britain and Europe who use these phrases as if there's something inevitable about youthful progressivism ought to understand that just as tides ebb and flow, so do generational demographic strengths. And the reason I mention this today is because of this headline in the London Daily Express. Marine Le Pen extends lead in first round of French presidential voting, new polls find. This is about Marine Le Pen, who is the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of the Front National, the National Front, which he led for many years. And at that time it was thought to be a rather narrow party for elderly French fascists, of whom there were more than you might imagine. And in 2002, Jean-Marie Le Pen managed to get into the final runoff of the French presidential election against Jacques Chirac, the sitting president, at which point the mainstream left and right in France came together to support Chirac and crush Jean-Marie Le Pen. It was one of those vote for the crook, not the fascist type elections. So they voted for the crook, Jacques Chirac, a randy crook in his case. Now, a mere 15 years later, Marine Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen's daughter, leads a very different kind of Front National, a very different kind of National Front party. And she's not going to make it into the runoff of the French election. She's going to be the #1 candidate going into that runoff. And yes, the supporters of the other parties will in the main agree to back whoever the other candidate is in that runoff. And she faces somewhat long odds on getting into the Élysée Palace and becoming president of France. But the odds aren't as great as they were for her father 15 years ago. And that's kind of odd, don't you think? Because 15 years ago, the assumption was that, oh, you know, all these old fascists will soon be dead, and then soon progressivist France will reject this kind of old-school fascism once and for all. Instead, Marine Le Pen leads a resurgent Front National that has a far broader appeal than her father ever did. And I like this poll, which comes, let me see this, they've got, I think they've got UK-style dating here. It's actually, so I've got to be careful, it's the 8th of February, so just a week or so ago. 8th of February this poll came out. France, different age groups and voting behavior. And they've got different, I've got to try and figure this out actually. I'm just saying, look, how about, we need to fire someone over this. They're coloured lines representing the candidates, and I've just realised it's been printed out in the black and white printer. So I'm going to try and tell between shades of grey which candidate is which. But the top line there, this, I hope this is in colour at the bit you're looking at, but the top line there is Marine Le Pen. That, as you can see, she's in the lead. And this is breaking it down by different age groups. And what's fascinating to me is that the left is absolutely wrong on this, that in fact her lowest support comes from the elderly. People who are 65 years and older, only 11% of them support Marine Le Pen. They all go for the left and the other mainstream parties. And Marine Le Pen only gets 11% of people over 65. So in other words, if we take the left's argument that all you guys are going to be dead soon, it's not Marine Le Pen's voters who are going to be dead soon. And then if you go to the other end, this is 18 to 24-year-olds. So this is the snowflake generation here. And Marine Le Pen is in second place behind the left-wing guy, Mélenchon. He's got 27% support, she's got 21% support. So Marine Le Pen, supposedly representing all these dead white males, is actually the #2 candidate of Generation Snowflake. Then when you move it up to what you might call the older snowflakes, 24 to 34 years old, 24 to 34 years old, let's look at that. She gets 31%. She is way out in the lead above any other candidate for young adult French men and women of 24 to 34-year-olds. And then in the kind of middle-age category, 35 to 49, 50 to 64, again, she leads. But basically, this is interesting to me for two reasons. First, it nails the lie that the new nationalism, at least in France, And we don't know how it's going to go in the United Kingdom post-Brexit. We don't know how it's going to go in the United States when Trump runs for re-election. But for Marine Le Pen, young French voters are supporting her in enormous numbers. She's made tremendous inroads there. And again, I want you to think about historical inevitability. The idea that somehow it's the old people who are racists and the young people who believe in the boundless multicultural utopia. This French poll actually shows exactly the opposite. It's the elderly French who still believe in the illusions of the post-war utopian state, and that's why only 11% of them support Marine Le Pen. And then back down among younger groups, 18 to 24 and 24 to 34-year-olds, as I said, Generation Snowflake and the mature snowflakes, the ones who have stayed in college to do a master's in colonialism and transgendered studies. She leads among young French people overwhelmingly in this poll. And I want to just think about why that is at the moment. Identity politics is all the rage in America. That's what the Coalition of the Ascendant is all about. It says what matters in the United States is not whether you're an American citizen equal before the law, but what approved identity group you belong to. And I mentioned some of the approved ones, Hispanic, gay, Muslim, transgender, whatever. They're approved. If you belong to other groups, not only don't they approve, they don't even think you are a group. So if you belong to the elderly white male group, that's not a group. That's not a respectable group. You're not meant to be a group. You're not meant to think and act like a group. You're just meant to be the people that are there for the other approved groups to act against. But that only holds so far. And if you are a young person in France, you are not growing up under the incremental change that the middle-aged and elderly French people have seen in the years since the Second World War. You are living in a wholly transformed France. It's said that in many French cities, for example, there's already a majority of the youth in certain French cities that are Muslim. So you're not thinking like a guilty native French majority anymore. You're not saddled by the multiculti guilt trip that your parents and grandparents get off on. You just know, for example, that when you go out at night in certain areas, it's not safe to venture there because the streets are controlled by certain of your youth cohort who do not look upon you, and especially your women folk, terribly favorably. And so you don't accept the premise of the respectable parties, and you are starting actually to do what the transgendered do, and the Hispanics do, and the lesbians do. And you are starting to think of yourself as a minority identity group. Nobody knows what the correct statistics are on Muslim birth rates in France. There was one poll last year that purported to show that a majority of French teenagers were now Muslim. And I had a very pleasant lunch with the great French demographer Michel Tribalat a few months ago, and she assured me that that was some kind of wacky poll and we weren't quite there yet. But we're on a course to be there, and young French people know it, and they are voting accordingly, and they are developing, as I said, a group identity. And that's why the most interesting thing will be whether this poll holds up in the first round of voting on French election day. And if Marine Le Pen leads among 24 to 34-year-old French voters, as she is leading in this remarkable poll, 31%, her next nearest competitor is 22%. If that number holds up, that will tell you where the young ethnic Frenchmen of tomorrow are going. And they're not going with the kind of parties that their parents and grandparents supported. As I said, what we are witnessing in Europe is a spectacular demographic transformation. We've seen similar things in the state of California, for example, which has had a massive rise in the Hispanic population since the 1970s. There's something slightly different about that, though. A lot of the time you can walk through the streets of an American city and you're no longer sure what anybody is, because in America people intermarry and have all kinds of relationships. I once found myself at a bar a couple of years ago talking to a young lady with very striking looks, and so I asked her where she came from, and she had a Filipino dad and a Slovene mom, and I thought only in America would a Slovene and a Filipino meet and date and produce a child, and a child who looked kind of semi-exotic, but you couldn't actually sort of place quite where or when or what kind of identity group she fit into. And there are really no identity groups for somebody like that. That is the melting pot. And so the more the United States government tries these neo-apartheid categorizations, the more they don't actually fit the reality on the ground. But the reality on the ground in, say, Saint-Denis in the Paris suburbs and the other banlieue, the reality on the ground in Toulouse, where I stood on one side of the street at dusk with a young French woman who said that she was happy to cross over to the other side of the street and the warren of little alleyways beyond during the day, but that she didn't go there after 5 o'clock at night. What is happening on the ground in French cities is much more disturbing than any demographic trends in the United States. It's essentially a large self-segregating population that is creating no-go zones where the writ of the French state does not really run. And you see that in Brussels, in parts of Brussels like Molenbeek and elsewhere. And as we talked about at the beginning of the week, you see it in Sweden too. And I talked about the epidemic of sexual assaults in Sweden. And I talked about the proliferation of crimes that had never been known in continental Europe, of routine gang rape of children and elderly grandmothers in public places, in parks, in railway stations, even in City Hall in one case in Germany. And I expressed my bewilderment, a little cynically, because I know full well why they don't. I expressed my bewilderment at the media's disinclination to cover this. But I did cover it. For many years I've gone to Malmo, which used to be the oldest Christian city in Denmark. It was the first Christian city in Denmark. And then, as is the way in old Europe, the borders changed hands and it wound up in Sweden, and it's now on course to be the first Muslim city in Sweden. And one day I was sitting in a bar, sitting in a coffee place, little table like this, and I found conversation with two rather charming blonde Swedish ladies. And they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to walk over to Rosengard and take a look." And they laughed. And they said they would never dream of walking over to Rosengard because it simply wasn't safe for them to do so. And danger is my middle name, and I laugh at fear. And after I'd laughed at fear a couple of times, the Swedish gals thought I was a bit crazy, and so averted their gaze and went off in someone more normal. And I set off walking to Rosengard, laughing at fear all the way. And as I walked, just a couple of miles, Rosengard is essentially a Muslim citadel on the edge of Malmo. And the immigrants who live there are Muslim. Often they come from Muslim countries like Turkey, where until recently it was normal for women to go uncovered, or they'd come from Bosnia, where it was normal for women to go uncovered, or the Central Asian stands, where it was normal for women to go uncovered. And then they'd arrive in Sweden, and be living in Sweden and find that they could not go uncovered, or the Muslim enforcers in their neighborhood would punish them. And I set off on my little walk, a couple of miles, and you're walking, and I like Swedish blondes. Who doesn't? I'm of an age to have greatly enjoyed Britt Ekland's performance in The Man with the Golden Gun. I love ABBA. I've got nothing against Anne Fried, the brunette in ABBA, but who doesn't love Anna, the blonde in ABBA? I like Swedish blondes, and I shall miss them when they're gone. And as I did that 2-mile walk from the city of Malmo to the heart of Rosengard, just looking at the people coming towards you on the sidewalk, all the Swedish blondes gradually thin out, and they're replaced by big, fierce, bearded men. And then you get to Rosengard, and there are no blondes at all. The blondes are gone. And any women you see are all covered and just hurrying children along or coming back from the shops. And I think more and more about that walk as the Swedish blondes thin out and the big bearded men replace them. And that was 5, 6, the first time I did that walk has got to be, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years before Angela Merkel admitted 1.5 million fit young men into her country, so-called refugees. But I've never forgotten that walk. And I understood as I walked every yard down that sidewalk from downtown Malmo to the heart of Rosengard, and the blondes thinned out to be replaced by big, fit, young, bearded Muslim men, that was Europe's future walking toward me. There is nothing inevitable about progressivism. As Turkey is learning, the Young Turks get old, and they are replaced by different Young Turks. In France, the young utopian progressives are being outvoted by young Frenchmen who are reaching different conclusions about France's future. And in Britain and America and the rest of the developed world, the assumption that nationalism is simply the province of dying white men is as foolish as all the other leftist delusions. We'll see you next time.